July 9, 1943. Solomon Islands, South Pacific. The ocean that morning looked calm, almost innocent, as if it had already forgotten how many men it had swallowed during the war. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long reflections across the water, reflections that danced like fire on steel. On land, palm trees stood shattered, burned, and broken. The jungle smelled of oil, smoke, and salt. Somewhere between the beach and the dense green interior of the island, an American tank crew prepared for a mission that history itself would later struggle to believe. No one, absolutely no one, expected a tank to fight a warship that day. Yet before the sun would set, the impossible would happen. This was the only time in recorded history when an American tank sank a Japanese warship. The Pacific War was not supposed to look like this. Tanks were designed for land. Warships ruled the sea. Their worlds were separate, divided by doctrine, training, and common sense. A tank commander never woke up expecting to duel steel floating miles offshore, and a naval captain never imagined his enemy would crawl out of the jungle on tracks. But war does not respect expectations. By mid-1943, the Solomon Islands had become one of the most violently contested regions on Earth. Every island was a stepping stone, every beach a battlefield, every reef a potential grave. The Japanese Imperial Navy had dominated these waters earlier in the war, supplying troops, evacuating wounded, and bombarding American positions whenever it pleased. Their destroyers were fast, aggressive, and deadly, designed to strike suddenly and vanish into the night. For the American forces on the islands, naval bombardments were terror made real. When Japanese warships appeared offshore, there was often nothing the soldiers could do but dig deeper, pray harder, and wait for the shells to stop falling. Artillery could rarely reach them. Aircraft were not always available, and tanks were never part of the equation. Until this moment, the American tank involved was not legendary. It was not massive. It was not even particularly modern by 1943 standards. It was an M3 Stuart, a light tank built for speed, not power. Its armor was thin compared to German monsters in Europe. Its main gun, a 37mm cannon, was considered barely adequate even against enemy armor on land. Against a warship, it should have been useless. But the battlefield does not judge by specifications alone. The crew of the tank, young men hardened by weeks of jungle fighting, had already learned one truth about the Pacific War. Nothing went according to plan. Maps lied, intelligence failed, and survival depended on adaptability more than orders. They had named their tank, as crews often did. To them, it was more than steel and machinery. It was shelter, weapon, and lifeline all in one. Inside its cramped interior, sweat soaked their uniforms. Engine noise drowned out thought, and fear lived permanently in the back of the mind. They had no idea they were about to make history. The Japanese destroyer appeared offshore like a predator, long, narrow, and fast. It moved confidently through waters it believed were uncontested. Its mission was simple: bombard American positions, disrupt operations, and withdraw before any serious response could form. Its guns opened fire. Shells screamed overhead and slammed into the island, throwing sand, trees, and debris into the air. Explosions walked their way inland, searching for targets. The ground shook. The jungle burned. Men hugged the earth as fragments tore through leaves and flesh alike. From the destroyer's bridge, this was routine. From the island, it was hell. Then something unexpected happened. American forward observers realized the destroyer had come, dangerously close to shore, closer than it should have. Perhaps the captain wanted better accuracy. Perhaps he underestimated the Americans. Or perhaps the shallow coastal waters deceived him. Whatever the reason, the warship was now within a range no one had seriously considered before. A range a tank could reach. The decision was not written in any manual. There was no doctrine for this. No training scenario. No historical precedent. The tank crew received word through frantic communication: if you can see it, try. Try. That single word carried the weight of desperation. Courage and insanity all at once. The tank rumbled forward through broken ground, its tracks grinding over roots and shell craters. Palm trunks scraped along its sides. The jungle opened just enough to reveal the sea, and there it was, a Japanese warship. Massive, armed, alive with fire. For a brief moment, the tank commander hesitated. He knew what tanks were made to fight. He also knew what warships were made to destroy. One direct hit from naval guns would tear the Stuart apart like paper. But the destroyer wasn't looking at them. It never imagined a tank could matter. The gunner aligned the sights. The 37mm cannon was never designed for naval combat, but it didn't need to sink the ship outright. It needed to damage something vital: steering, engines, fuel, or weapons. At this distance, even a small shell could become catastrophic. Fire. The tank fired. The recoil shook the vehicle. The shell streaked across open air and struck the destroyer's side. Metal rang. Sparks flew. The crew watched, stunned, as smoke began to curl upward from the impact point. They fired again. And again. Each shot was a gamble against physics and probability. But the range was short. The angle was unforgiving. And the destroyer's thin upper structures were never designed to resist. Armor-piercing fire from land. Something aboard the ship went wrong. Very wrong. The destroyer suddenly changed course, listing slightly. Its guns faltered. Smoke thickened. Flames began licking along its deck. What had started as a routine bombardment was now chaos. Damage control teams scrambled. Orders were shouted. The ship's confidence shattered. Under the realization that it was under attack from land, from a tank. For the first time in naval history, a warship was fighting an armored vehicle, and losing. The tank crew did not celebrate. They kept firing. They understood something the ship's captain now realized too late. Once the balance of power shifts, hesitation kills. Another shell struck near the waterline. Another punched into the superstructure. Fire spread faster than it could be contained. The destroyer's engines lost power. Momentum faded. The sea began to claim its own. As smoke darkened the sky, the Japanese ship drifted helplessly. Flames consumed ammunition stores. Secondary explosions tore through the hull. What should never have happened was now inevitable. The destroyer began to sink. Not from torpedoes, not from bombs, but from the gun of an American tank hidden in the jungle. Word spread rapidly among American forces. At first, no one believed it. A tank sinking a warship sounded like a rumor born from exhaustion or shock. But the burning wreck offshore told the truth no report could exaggerate. History had just bent. The laws of warfare had been rewritten, not by technology, but by opportunity and courage. And the crew inside that tank had no idea. Their names would one day be spoken in disbelief. The moment the Japanese destroyer began to sink, silence briefly replaced the chaos on shore. American soldiers who had spent weeks listening to incoming shells stood frozen, staring at the burning shape offshore. Some thought it was a trick of smoke and distance. Others believed the ship was merely withdrawing. But then the angle of the hull changed, unmistakably wrong, and the sea rushed in where steel had failed. Flames flickered lower as water climbed higher, and the truth settled in with a weight heavier than any explosion. The warship was dying. Inside the tank, the crew did not cheer. There was no celebration, no raised fists, no victory cries. Instead, there was stunned disbelief. These men had trained to fight infantry, to support advances, to survive ambushes in the jungle, not to cripple naval power. Sweat dripped from their helmets as they watched the impossible unfold through narrow vision slits. Each man understood that if the destroyer had noticed them sooner, they would already be dead. Survival had come not from strength, but from surprise. As the destroyer's stern slipped beneath the waves, secondary explosions tore through its interior. Ammunition cooked off. Fuel ignited. Black smoke climbed into the sky like a signal flare announcing disaster. Japanese sailors jumped into the water, clinging to debris, fighting currents, fighting fear. The sea, indifferent and merciless, swallowed metal, fire, and men alike. Within minutes, the proud warship that had ruled these waters was gone. For the Japanese Navy, this was more than a loss of a single vessel. It was a psychological shock. Warships were symbols of dominance, mobility, and control. They were not supposed to be vulnerable to ground fire, especially not from a light tank. Reports sent up the chain of command were met with confusion, disbelief, and quiet embarrassment. Some officers questioned the accuracy of the account. Others suspected exaggeration. But the wreckage offshore could not be argued with. On the American side, officers rushed to document what had happened. Photographs were taken, statements recorded, diagrams sketched, not because it would change tactics overnight, but because history demanded proof. Even seasoned commanders struggled to explain it. A tank sinking a destroyer went against everything naval and ground warfare had taught them. Yet there it was, undeniable. The crew of the tank were questioned repeatedly. They described the range, the angle, the point of impact. They spoke about firing again and again, not knowing if anything was working until smoke appeared. Their voices carried the exhaustion of men who had pushed past logic and survived. None of them claimed heroism. They simply explained that they had been told to try, and so they did. The Japanese loss had immediate effects. Naval commanders became more cautious near shorelines. Bombardments were conducted from safer distances. Destroyers no longer hugged the coast with the same confidence, even though the odds of such an event repeating were extremely low. The psychological damage lingered. The sea was no longer entirely safe from the land. For American troops on the islands, morale surged. For once, they had not just endured naval fire, they had answered it. The idea that ingenuity and awareness could overcome superior firepower spread rapidly through the ranks. Stories of the tank crew traveled faster than official reports, growing larger with each retelling, to soldiers fighting an enemy that often seemed untouchable. This moment mattered deeply, yet strategically the U.S. command understood the truth. This was not a new doctrine. Tanks would not begin hunting warships. The event was an anomaly, a rare alignment of positioning, opportunity, and human decision. But anomalies shape memory, and memory shapes legend. As weeks passed, the battlefield moved on. New islands were invaded, new ships were lost, new graves were filled. The Pacific War continued its brutal march toward Japan, but the story remained, tucked into after-action reports and whispered among veterans, who knew they had witnessed something no one else ever would again. The tank itself returned to normal duty. Its gun fired at bunkers, machine gun nests, and jungle positions. The crew rotated, reassigned, replaced. War moved forward without pausing to honor the moment. There were no parades, no medals carved with references to naval combat, just another strange chapter written quietly in the margins of history. Decades later, historians would stumble across the incident and pause. They would reread reports, cross-check naval losses, and confirm the timeline. Again and again, the same conclusion emerged. It happened, once, and never again. In the months that followed, the incident quietly slipped into obscurity, not because it lacked importance, but because it defied categorization. Military history depends on patterns: what works, what fails, what can be repeated. This event offered none of that. It could not be turned into doctrine, could not be scaled, and could not be reliably recreated, and so it became a footnote, mentioned briefly, then passed over in favor of battles that fit more comfortably into textbooks. Yet for those who studied the Pacific War deeply, the story lingered like an unanswered question. How could a light tank armed with a modest cannon overcome a naval vessel designed to withstand combat at sea? The answer lay not in raw power, but in circumstance. The destroyer had sailed too close to shore. The angle of fire had been wrong. The American crew had the element of surprise. And perhaps most importantly, no one on the ship believed they were in danger from the land. Naval warfare doctrine had long assumed that the coastline was a place of advantage, not vulnerability. Ships could approach, deliver fire, and retreat at will. The ocean was their shield. What this incident exposed was a rare but real blind spot. Proximity could turn dominance into liability. Thin armor above the waterline, exposed systems, and the assumption of safety combined into a perfect storm of miscalculation. Despite this, no sweeping changes followed. Warships did not suddenly fear tanks. The probability of such an encounter was too low. Most coastlines lacked the terrain, visibility, or positioning required. Tanks rarely had line of sight to ships, and even when they did, ships usually noticed them first. The Pacific simply offered a unique moment where all variables aligned. What made the event truly singular was not the technology involved, but the human decision-making. The American crew chose to fire when hesitation would have been safer. They acted without orders written for such a situation. They trusted instinct over expectation. In war, that kind of choice often leads to disaster. This time it led to legend. Japanese records from the period are sparse, but those that survive hint at frustration and disbelief. The loss was officially attributed to shore-based fire, avoiding detailed explanation. There was no incentive to highlight that a warship had been defeated by a tank. In a conflict built on honor, hierarchy, and perceived superiority, the narrative was quietly buried. As decades passed, veterans aged and memories faded. Many who had witnessed the sinking carried the story with them into silence, assuming no one would believe it. Some mentioned it in reunions, others in private journals. Only later, when historians cross-referenced naval losses with ground action reports, did the full picture reemerge. The story resurfaced in academic circles, then slowly trickled into popular history. Each retelling sparked the same reaction: disbelief, followed by fascination. It challenged assumptions about warfare and reminded audiences that history is not always shaped by the largest weapons or the most powerful fleets, but by moments of unexpected convergence. The tank crew themselves never became famous. There were no movies made about them, no statues erected in their honor. They returned home, lived ordinary lives, and carried an extraordinary moment within them. Their greatest achievement was not glory, but survival, and a story that would outlive them. As modern warfare evolved, the gap between land and sea combat grew even wider. Missiles replaced guns, satellites replaced spotters. The idea of a tank threatening a warship became absurd once more. Technology closed the door that chance had briefly opened in 1943, and yet the incident remains frozen in time, a reminder that war is not always won by the expected weapon, the superior force, or the planned maneuver. Sometimes it is decided by awareness, courage, and a single decision made in seconds. A tank fired at the sea, and the sea answered. History often remembers power in familiar forms. It remembers fleets colliding across oceans, bombers darkening the sky, and armies clashing across open ground. What it rarely remembers are the moments that refuse to fit the rules, the moments that feel almost accidental, yet permanently alter the story. This was one of those moments. A light tank, never meant to face the sea, stood its ground and rewrote a line no one believed could be crossed. What makes this event endure is not the destruction of a single warship, but the lesson hidden within it. War is not a chessboard where every piece behaves as expected. It is chaos shaped by human judgment, by seconds of hesitation or resolve, by the willingness to act when logic says retreat. The crew inside that tank did not know they were making history. They only knew that if they did nothing, the shells would keep falling and men would keep dying, and so they fired. That decision, simple, unplanned, and irreversible, echoes far beyond the wreckage resting on the ocean floor. It reminds us that dominance is fragile, that assumptions can be fatal, and that even the most advanced machines are only as effective as the minds guiding them. The Japanese destroyer was built for speed, firepower, and control of the sea. Yet in one unguarded moment, it was undone by surprise and proximity. This is why the event never happened again. Not because it was impossible, but because it was improbable. Because modern warfare learned from it, sealed its weaknesses, and tightened the divide between land and sea. The door that briefly opened in the Pacific closed almost as quickly, leaving behind only a story that sounds unreal, until you realize it is true. Somewhere beneath the waves, the remains of that warship still rest in silence. Somewhere in forgotten archives, reports describe a tank firing toward the ocean. And somewhere in history, a single moment stands alone, untouched, unmatched, and unrepeatable. A reminder that war does not always belong to the strongest force. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who dare to try. The only time in history when a tank sank a warship. Thanks for watching.